If everyone could please find their spots. Thank you so much for joining for our last few speakers. First up, we have Tim Hanrahan from Rio Applied Science and Engineering. He'll be speaking on wildfire and river restoration, case studies from the Methow River Watershed.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thanks for sticking around for this last few talks here. Appreciate that. Before I get too far into talking about the case studies, I want to just provide a little bit of context for the work that we did. So late last year, the 5th National Climate Assessment was completed. And in that assessment, there was a chapter specifically on western wildfires. And the upshot of their findings were that temperatures are rising in the Pacific Northwest and fires are getting worse. So we have that backdrop coupled with what a lot of speakers have talked about earlier today, and increasing investments in habitat restoration in the Northwest. So we have these two things that are coming together and creating the need for a more rigorous consideration of wildfire impacts in the context of stream restoration planning and design. And so it was the Yakama Nation fisheries staff and the Tributary Habitat Committee, comprised of BPA and Reclamation, that took an initial step at addressing this need and created this case study project that had one primary overarching goal, and that was to inform future restoration designs by incorporating information from the recent scientific literature, as well as from lessons learned from restoration projects that experienced direct and indirect effects from wildfire. So the work for these case studies took place in the Methow River Watershed in north central Washington there. The approach for doing these case studies, we completed site visits to 2 restoration treatment study areas. One of those was in the Chewuk River. That's the watershed on the upper center part of the map there. The restoration areas were located along near the outlet of that watershed. The second treatment study area was in Beaver Creek. That watershed is to the east of Winthrop and Twisp there in the lower right part of that map. And that work was done on private land near the outlet of that watershed. And then lastly, we took some site visits and included as one of the case study areas the Wolf Creek watershed. And what's interesting about that is that watershed is about 80% wilderness area managed by the U.S. Forest Service. That watershed there is on the lower left part of the map. We compiled the fire history for these 3 watersheds, and then we also took advantage of some pre- and post-fire monitoring observations that had been done for all of these areas, including the reference study area in Wolf Creek. There's been some consideration for restoration work on private lands near the watershed outlet, and so there's been some ongoing planning and assessment and evaluation going on there, so we took advantage of that. The restoration itself that took place in these 2 areas, the Chewuk and Beaver Creek, were more or less the same thing. So the primary treatments included large wood structures of varying types, included secondary channel improvements and revegetation work, both in the riparian zone and in uplands. The map there on the top is the Chewuk River. You probably can't see that too well. Construction took place at 15 sites over 7 river miles during 3 years, 2015, 17, and 18. And then the construction at Beaver Creek took place at 12 sites over 1 river mile in 2013. Wanted to talk a little bit about the typical fire regime in these watersheds, because they're more or less the same and they're very similar throughout much of the North Cascades. If you look at that table on the bottom there, that's a table of the expected fire regime in these watersheds, and about 40 to 50% of these watersheds are in this fire regime 1 category, where there's a mixed severity fire, expected at return intervals of less than 35 years. And then there's another 40 to 50% of these watersheds that are in that fire regime 3 category, with mixed severity fires expected between 35 years and about 200 years. But what we've seen in these watersheds in the North Cascades and in these case study watersheds is that there's really been modest fire occurrence for 100+ years until the most recent 20 years, when there's been much more significant wildfire activity. So that plot there in the middle is a plot of percent of a watershed area burned. In this case, it's the Chewuk study area watershed over time. And you can see that we had over 100 years with very little fire activity until this last 20 years, when it's been much more marked. And it's those fires that affected the case study areas that I'll be talking about. So the actual fire history in these watersheds, the Chewuk River watershed was affected by the Cub Creek fire, which occurred in 2021. So that was 3 years after the last restoration work occurred in that study area. Just some highlights from that: about 40% of the burned area had a high or moderate soil burn severity. There was an 80 to 100% vegetation mortality in those areas with moderate and high burn severities. The Beaver Creek watershed, which is in the upper part of this image, was burned by the Carlton Complex fire in 2014. So that was 1 year after the last restoration work occurred in this watershed. About 40% of the riparian areas in Beaver Creek burned. And then lastly, the Wolf Creek watershed. That watershed was burned by the Cedar Creek fire in 2021. About 80% of the contributing watershed burned, and it was the largest wildfire ever recorded in Wolf Creek. So, big fire. So some of the lessons learned from these case studies, I'll go through a number of these lessons learned that apply to many of the sites. The fire effects were sporadic, so burn sites were both spatially distributed and also sometimes clustered. So in the Chewuk River, that panel on the left there, 8 of the 15 sites were fire impacted. And you can see that some of those fire impacted sites were clustered, like the downstream end of burned sites there, and then some were really isolated. So right in the middle of that sub-reach there, we had a burned site that was affected, and none of the sites around it were affected. And then similarly for Beaver Creek in that right panel there, 8 of the 12 sites were fire impacted, and the burn sites were both spatially distributed and clustered as well. Risk to bank structures, so those structures that were built more bank attached were particularly susceptible to burning, so with those structures with limited projection into the active channel. Here's 2 photographs, pre and post fire, left and right, from the Chewuk River as an example of that. You can see on the right there, much of the core of that structure is burned. Another lesson learned, submergence increases resilience. Submerged or partially submerged log members were much more resilient to fire damage than upper elevation members. And this seems really intuitive, right, that wet stuff doesn't burn, but it does bring up some really interesting ideas about designing these structures in the future that we can talk about later on. And this is an example, again, from the Chewuk River. And it was a similar story for some structures in Beaver Creek. So the photograph on the left there is a mid-channel large apex structure, and then pre-fire. And then on the right there is 3 months post-fire. So much of those lower elevation log members, large log members, have persisted through that fire. And we also observed the same thing on natural log jams. So here's an example from Wolf Creek. That photograph in the upper right shows a large channel spanning log jam in 2020 pre-fire. The center photograph is 3 months post-fire, so you see a lot of the larger core members remaining in that structure, and then 1 year post-fire in that bottom panel where that structure is starting to rack up mobile wood supplied from upstream. Ignition of slash material was an issue, so that material was especially vulnerable to ignition, and most of that appeared to have occurred from spotting or firebrands that were airborne rather than direct impingement of the fire on the structure itself. And just another ground shot example that you can see those lower elevation members retained in the structure while much of that racking material had burned out. Size, class, diameter was important for resiliency, so large material stuff seemed to stick around. The perimeter of those logs burned, but there was enough mass remaining that those logs provided some function. Just another photograph, Beaver Creek, same principle. Large logs remained and then served some functionality post-fire, 3 years post-fire. And this notion of remnant functionality seemed to be important. So while slash and racking material burned out of a lot of these structures, what remained did provide some remnant functionality. This is a photograph of a different log jam, Apex log jam in Beaver Creek, 3 months post-fire. On the left panel there, you can see those large log members remaining, and then on the right there is 3 years post-fire, providing functionality of racking up mobile wood, sorting sediment, providing an opportunity for riparian vegetation to grow behind it. And we observed the same thing occurring in Wolf Creek, so natural log jam. So top photograph, another large channel spanning log jam there. The middle photograph shows that smaller material burned out of it, leaving some of the large log members in place. And then that bottom photograph showing the functionality that remaining structure is providing. Lastly, floodplain resiliency. So those areas that already had low elevation floodplains with robust riparian plant communities, they were really effective at not just inhibiting fire severity to begin with, but also in fostering the rapid recovery and regen of the plant community. And similar story with beaver activity. So beaver activity was observed in Beaver Creek before and after construction, as well as before and after some other flooding that had occurred there. And that beaver activity helped to inhibit the fire severity to begin with, and then it also fostered really rapid recovery. So from all this work, we developed 3 kind of overarching recommendations to the community as a whole, I guess, and to the Tributary Habitat Steering Committee and the Yakama Nations. And one of those is to complete project-specific wildfire risk assessments, just as a course of doing this planning and design. So, we're already doing risk assessments for things like channel migration and large wood mobility and flood hazards and things like that. And it seems like we're at the point where doing wildfire risk assessments as part of our routine planning is probably warranted in a lot of watersheds. And it seems like it's a huge lift to do that, but we've been amazed at how advanced and how developed the wildfire science community is and the climate change community is at having tools and data available to the community to use in these risk assessments. So things like mapping of fire boundaries exist, maps of fire severity exist, predictions of post-fire debris flows exist, equations exist for post-fire flood frequency analysis. So there's a lot of things out there that we can use. We just need to figure out how to use those in risk assessments. And then the second major recommendation is to use this information from risk assessments to design for fire risk mitigation. So now that we have all this information, even in project scoping, should we be doing a project in this particular reach, knowing what we know now about fire risk, or should we specifically be doing something in this reach because of the fire risk that's potential there? Things like that. And then lastly, a recommendation to funding and resource management agencies really at all levels to foster this design, adaptation, and planning. So coordinate to do more of these case studies throughout the whole Columbia River Basin in different environments, and then to work as a community towards developing standardized guidelines for doing these risk assessments and planning out restoration projects in the face of wildfire. So thanks for your time. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to me or Mike Brunfelt at Interfluve, or if you have time to hit that QR code, you can download the full report from our website. So, thank you.
All right, next up, we have Jared Johnson from Yakama Nation, and he will be speaking on using helicopters for large-scale restoration on the Twisp River.
Thanks, Ariel. My name is Jared Johnson. I have worked for the Yakama Nation for about 12 years. I'm a habitat restoration practitioner in the Methow subbasin primarily, and I'm going to tell a story about some restoration that we completed in 2022, primarily on Forest Service land. So the Yakama Nation and the Colville Confederated Tribes proposed independent projects to the forest to do some large-scale restoration throughout about 11 miles of the main stem Twisp River and lower Little Bridge Creek and upper Little Bridge Creek. The story that I'm going to talk about, just due to time constraints, is really focusing on some of the work that I did on the Mystery Reach and War Creek Reach of the Twisp River. And I'm going to start out giving a little bit of background about how we got here and kind of what the project entails, and then show some photos and videos of kind of the results that we've seen so far. So the RTT identified this Middle Twisp Assessment Unit, HUC 12, as a high priority reach for restoration and protection actions for assisting recovery of spring chinook and steelhead. The project that I'm going to be talking about is pretty much only located in the Middle Twisp Assessment Unit. There's about a half mile that extends into the Upper Twisp Assessment Unit. In general, the Twisp River watershed has experienced a lot of similar impacts due to some of the post-colonial efforts in the watershed that a lot of other places have. We have a very simplified system where bridge abutments and roads kind of have bisected some of the tributaries as well as the hill slopes. We have a pretty rich history of logging along riparian areas and specific locations within the watershed, and then there's also a very rich history of mining kind of throughout the Twisp River. In 2015 and 2017, the Yakama Nation completed 2 different reach assessments within the project areas, and really what we wanted to get from there was this reach-based ecosystem indicators that really provide us an illustration for what some of the habitat impairments were in these specific reaches. It also allowed us to collect habitat level 2 data to do some of those analyses and that fed into the matrix and determine kind of what the quantity of large wood was that existed pre-project. And then we used some research by Fox and Bolton to look at what the historical wood loading conditions could have been within this system if it was an unmanaged forest in a similar ecotype. What we did there is we took the recommendations from the paper by Fox and Bolton and subtracted the existing large wood numbers from that to then develop our wood loading criteria for the project. And I just hit the wrong button, sorry. So we had a couple different things going for us in this project area that really led us to using helicopters. We had some really long access routes through some robust riparian vegetation where the impacts of conventional equipment would have been unacceptable for us and the land manager. And then we also just had some areas that had very steep terrain down to the floodplain and just precluded access with conventional equipment. Accompanying that is we had some very beneficial geomorphic conditions for us to install a lot of loose wood in aggregations or log structures that were constructed with the helicopter, which then provided us some level of comfort that there would be a minimal risk to downstream private property and infrastructure. So in the case of the Mystery Reach, which is around River Mile 20, at the downstream end of that project area, we have a geomorphic constriction called the Twisp River Canyon, where the entire river is squeezed into about a 40-foot wide canyon that's only maybe 300 feet long or so. So that creates a hydraulic backwater and a large depositional area upstream for retainment of wood. Additionally, at the downstream end of the War Creek Reach, we had a very accessible floodplain where if we installed structures in the main stem to retain mobilized wood that we had placed upstream, the wood and the water would really have an opportunity to disperse onto that floodplain. And so we were able to retain a lot of wood down there. So our goals were fairly simple. We really just wanted to restore some natural riverine processes that create and maintain complex habitats. We looked a lot at opportunities where we thought we could install this loose wood into log jams, basically, and they would stay under some normal flow conditions, with the recognition that we have very little control over the hydrology that we're going to see on an annual basis here. So we did that. We built, I'm going to bump over to logistics real quick, apparently. There's a lot that goes into using helicopters, and if anybody has any questions about it, please come talk to me. But really, what we were able to do is develop a number of service landings so that we decreased our flight time and decreased our overall costs, so that it ended up being a very cost-effective way to do it. I can talk more about that later. So throughout these two reaches, we installed a total of 48 log structures, which is a fairly intensive restoration effort. We installed nearly 1,000 logs with root wads and ended up ballasting 9 large wood structures to use as retainment features for mobilized wood. It was relatively inexpensive to do this large of a restoration effort, since we just primarily used a helicopter. This $364,000 for installation of nearly 1,000 logs and slash bundles is really fairly cost effective. The large wood, on the other hand, was fairly expensive because it was brought in from Outer Basin. And I'd like to also just take an opportunity to thank the funders from the Wells Tributary Committee, BPA, Fish Accords, and then RCO and Surfboard also provided some funding for this project. Could you hit play on that? So this is just really to kind of give you guys a perspective of what it looks like when there's a helicopter flying in 2 40-foot long, 20-inch diameter root wads, and the level of precision that you can expect to have using such a coarse instrument as a helicopter when constructing these features. Now, I have a series of aerial imagery from before the project, immediately after the project, and then post-runoff in 2023. The 2023 freshet that we had exceeded about 3,000 CFS on the Twisp River, which was right around a 10-year event. So we had the wood that we installed pretty much immediately had a lot of flow on it. And it did a lot of interesting things to kind of the geomorphology around the individual sites, and then also on the reach as a whole. So on the far left, November 2020 is when that aerial photo was taken. You can see that there's no visible wood in the stream. It's a fairly plain bed, simplified system. Immediately after the project, you can see that we installed 3 large wood structures. And then after the freshet, you can see a significant amount of deposition in the fore and the lee of the structures, and then significant pool development where shear stress created some scour kind of on the distal edge of the structures. The river in these slides is moving from the top to the bottom of the slide itself. And so, anyway. This is a similar time sequence. You can see we did some pretty large structure building kind of in the middle of the screen here. And after the freshet, we had significant lateral migration, some very large tree recruitment, over 150-foot tall spruce trees that were significantly larger than the material that we were able to acquire for the project. And you'll notice that we really tried to locate these structures on gravel bars or along banks or geomorphic features that we thought would naturally retain this wood at a higher rate than just placing it at a somewhat randomized location in the stream. There are some locations in the reaches that are very transporty, have very little connectivity opportunity to floodplains. Lateral migration would be impaired by hardened banks, like naturally hardened banks. And so there are some locations that weren't favorable for this type of work. This last image is showing that there was a lot of the mobilized material ended up racking into this one depositional area that's upstream of that canyon. And we can see that it basically clogged off the main channel to some extent, though the porosity of the structure currently still allows some flow, even at base flow conditions in October, to flow through it into multi-thread systems. Then we also got a lot of lateral connectivity because basically the river took a 90-degree angle and headed south, adjacent to that large wood accumulation. And here's a ground picture of that accumulation. So you see that there's a lot of imported material, imported wood that was mobilized, but then there's also a lot of stuff that was recruited from the banks upstream. We're now moving down into the War Creek Reach, and you can see similar, similar story of fairly simplified channel, very little large wood. We came in, we installed some large wood structures. Some of them stayed, some of them grew, and we got a significant amount of deposition, kind of lateral migration into some riparian trees and pool development. This is a photo of the same structures at 2200 CFS, and you can notice that there is a significant amount of water that's being forced onto the floodplain on river left as we're looking downstream at these structures. And then these are the final two that I'm going to share with you. They were installed to retain any wood that was mobilized from upstream. These are both piling ballasted, and it's difficult to see because of the way the shadows are casting light across the river on the October photo, but basically this is the upstream structure. It was a center of the river roughly, apex jam that we vibratory drive pilings for, and then used all thread to lace into place. And then on the face of that, we installed some slash, the same slash that we had for all the other sites as well. So it's a very coarse material. And then at high flow, you can see that it's creating a significant pressure wave and backing up water. And then in the background of that photo, you can see it's also forcing the river to laterally migrate to the right and recruiting trees off of that floodplain. This is the downstream structure, and then the downstream structure at high flow, generally speaking, and the active recruitment of trees and material. So we learned quite a bit from this work. I really want to also give a big shout out to Mike McAllister and Mike Brunfelt, who provided the design work through Interflu, but then also just a wealth of knowledge on kind of geomorphic conditions and engineering for large wood structures in general. But a few of the lessons that we learned. Anybody can build a large wood structure that isn't going to wash away. It just doesn't have to have very much engagement to the river. And it's a nice balance, or you're trying to develop a good balance between the hydraulic interaction that you're getting and the stability of the feature. And so I think in a lot of cases, we really hit that mark very well for something that really isn't a ballasted hard structure. The height and the weight of the structure matters significantly, and then the ability for the river to kind of adapt, evolve, lateral migrate, and flank these structures also really led to the longevity of them. In areas where we did pull or fall trees, they had a very short residence time. They were quick to just wash out, partially because they have a lot of drag associated with green tops and stuff. Geomorphic control was really important, and you know, we had a nice retainment area. Nobody cares about the monitoring plan. That's all I have.
All right, our final speaker is Ryan Klett from the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation. The title of his talk is Wood Abundance in the Methow and Okanogan Subbasins, Implications for the Scale of Restoration Action.
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to start by saying that this talk was really inspired by the work that Jared just talked about and some of the work that the other Yakama Nation employees and fisheries program implemented, as well as the Colville Tribes program, who I work for. I'm a habitat biologist at the Colville Tribes. Matt Young in our UCHIP program did some similar projects, and that's kind of what got me going on the topic of my talk today. So I had some basic questions that I wanted to answer, very similar to what Jared just mentioned. And the question was, what is the total abundance of wood? But what is that abundance at multiple scales, which I will define in a second. And then how much wood is needed to achieve a quote-unquote restored condition? So if we took what we have and then what we think we could have or should have, what is that delta between those two values? And then not only that, but where is the greatest benefit of a wood project likely at multiple scales? So in grad school, if there's one thing I learned from my thesis advisor, Christian Torgerson, is that you have to define your scale. And I want to do that very explicitly. So the scales that we do our modeling at are the subbasin, which is an 8-digit USGS HUC, and we're talking about 100 plus kilometers of linear stream habitat. And then nested within that are subwatersheds, the 12-digit USGS HUCs, and these are really collections of about 10, 20, 30 kilometers of linear stream habitat. And then the finest scale we do our modeling and reporting at is the reach scale. And these are 1 to 4 kilometer geomorphically unique or distinct sections of the stream habitat. So some of the data and information that went into this analysis. In the Methow, there are a lot of agencies who have been doing a lot of monitoring for a long, long time. And so there's a piecemeal of data that we sort of relied on. And that includes some information from ancient history, subbasin planning, U.S. Forest Service Level 2 surveys, Yakama Nation fisheries, reach assessments, ICEMP and CHAMP data, and as well as some Cascade Fisheries data. In the Okanogan, we pretty much had the Colville Tribes OBMEP, that's Okanogan Basin Monitoring and Evaluation Program data to rely on. And what a lot of those data look like, there's just a stream segment on the left and then a larger main stem habitat and polygons. Essentially, counts of wood are associated at channel unit scale, sort of pools, riffles, whatnot, which really, really lends itself when you're collecting information at that fine grain to rolling it up over a much larger extent. And I also wanted to touch on sort of the difference among these protocols and those data as far as sort of what counts as a piece of large wood. And the differences are sometimes subtle, but sometimes very meaningful. For ODMAP, we have a sort of small, large classification which came from some timber, fish, and wildlife recommendations. But our basic unit is we're talking about a piece of wood that's 10 centimeters diameter and at least 2 meters long. In contrast to U.S. Forest Service Level 2 recommendations, which is also Yakama Nation Fisheries program, uses those Level 2 survey protocols. So their pieces of wood are much larger in general to be counted, and that can cause some differences in sort of comparing the basins, but we'll see that a little later on. In any event, I'm not the first person to point this out. There's a really nice metadata study and some recommendations by Wool et al. Really looking at the diversity of those size classes and really calling for unification and a standardization of what counts and what doesn't and how we should go about measuring those. I'm not going to go into that anymore. One thing that was fairly similar among these protocols is that in general, to be counted, wood has to be engaged in the bankful channel. But there is some variance, and again, I refer back to that Wool paper that's some of the confounding factors that I dealt with in sort of compiling this data and putting it together. So the Methow and the Okanogan are in north central Washington. We're down here at the Red Star in the geographic center of Washington. The Methow is about 4,700 square kilometers, and it's about 516 kilometers of anadromous habitat in our analysis network that the Colville Tribes models on. The Okanogan is a much, much, much larger subbasin. It's actually about the size of the state of Washington west of I-5. Over 21,000 square kilometers and about 450 kilometers of linear stream habitat. So OBMAP uses the third generation of ecosystem diagnosis and treatment to aggregate and synthesize our habitat monitoring data. That's kind of a long-winded way of saying, normally when you guys would see this slide, I would then launch into these model results. And then talk about data priorities and project types and limiting factors and that kind of thing. I'm actually going to turn this on its head a little bit for the rest of the analysis today. And the answer to my questions was actually built into the modeling that we're doing in the Okanogan and the Methow already. So we're going to actually drill back down into some of the underlying structure of this and go from there. So the modeling structure is, again, on that three-tiered hierarchy of scale. So we're at this modeling at the subbasin scale, the subwatershed scale, and also the reach scale. And nested into that reach scale, that's really where we spend our time developing habitat data and then attaching it to that modeling structure in that reach network at the reach scale. So a lot of the monitoring that goes on, looking at specific things such as temperature, flow, wood, substrate, is collected at a somewhat finer resolution and then aggregated at the reach scale. And then that goes into the model structure and is rolled up through the various spatial scales. And EDT3 takes that habitat environment and then combines it with a set of species habitat rules, kind of where fish are in the environment. And essentially they move through a survival landscape in the modeling. And that's not particularly important for this talk today. But what is important and for the prioritization is that with the modeling structure combines all that into a set of viable salmon population parameters. And those parameters are habitat capacity, productivity, abundance, and diversity. And then a little further, the model operates in what's known as a patient template scenario. Essentially, so we're taking habitat function defined as those parameters and providing and modeling a set of those for every condition. So essentially a template condition is our restoration ideal, and then our patient condition is sort of the recent history, the most recent modeling scenario. We're working on our 5th scenario, patient scenario in the Okanogan currently, and we have run 2 scenarios in the Methow in the last 10 years, a 2014 and a 2020 scenario. But the real prioritization in the model structure takes place in changes in habitat between those scenarios. And those changes in habitat are reflected as changes in those VSP parameters. In particular, since we have all this structure already built out, I wanted to look at what the change in wood was, just the change in wood between our most recent condition in these various subbasins. And then I used the Fox and Bolton recommendations as sort of our restoration ideal or target. So to define some of the underlying calculations, at the subbasin level, the abundance of wood was just simply the sum of the pieces per reach. And in this case, the whole is really the sum of the parts. So it's just that total number of pieces in the monitoring data at the reach scale rolled up to the sub-watershed scale and then the subbasin scale. And then the difference between where we're at and where we could be, summed was really the, sorry, I lost my train of thought. So the delta between our current and sort of historic condition was really where we could go with that analysis. Then I also wanted to look at the sub-watershed scale, which is that same summation of the difference in pieces between the two scenarios divided into their spatial unit. But then I want to look at prioritization and applied the prioritization from the modeling we do to look at the highest priority 1/3 at the sub-watershed scale, defined as the change in modeled population abundance. And for the Okanogan, I looked at summer steelhead, and for the Methow, I combined the results for spring chinook and summer steelhead. And then at the reach scale, we're going to look at just the highest priority 1/4 of those reaches. So I'm going to focus on the Okanogan first. So in the US portion of the Okanogan, the current quote-unquote population at the subbasin scale of large wood in that reach network is about 21,000 pieces of wood. If we wanted to move towards that Fox and Bolton 2007 ideal, we would need to add about 72,000 pieces of wood. That's not really a realistic restoration project. So this is where that prioritization comes in. So at the sub-watershed scale, looking at that highest priority 1/3 of sub-watersheds, we would need to add about 21,000 pieces of wood to the sub-watersheds. I've got color-coded in sort of the yellow to red bar there. And the gradation of yellow, orange, and red is just sort of to give some detail to that. And then at the reach scale, at the highest quarter reaches, we need to add about 19,000 pieces of wood. And that reach scale priority is really just sort of further defining that sub-watershed scale priority. In the Methow, the current quote-unquote population of wood was about 45,000 pieces, much, much greater. But to get to that restoration ideal, we need to add about 123,000 pieces of wood. At the sub-watershed scale, because I combined the prioritization for spring chinook and summer steelhead, that resulted in about half of the sub-watersheds being a priority for restoration, and mainly main stem habitats. Those of you who are familiar with the Methow, it's basically the entirety of the Chewok, Methow, and Twisp rivers. But if we were going to approach it from that direction, in total, that would be a summation of about 82,000 pieces of wood. And if we focused on the reach scale, that would be about 71,000 pieces of wood. A lot of the project areas that Jared addressed and Matt Young with Colville Tribes addressed are actually in those priority areas in that Twisp River. So for a little context, this sort of analysis is a little dangerous because it does sort of, and I catch myself looking at it and saying, we could just add this wood and there we go, but that's not really how restoration works, and that's not necessarily a defining function. That this count of wood is really a proxy of wood function in the environment, and then to sort of use this information, we really need to consider the whole wood regime, and there's been a wealth of literature out there looking at process-based restoration and natural wood regime, and I think that the real answer probably lies somewhere in all of those things combined. So I wanted to sort of close and wrap up with a couple photos from Matt Young, and this is a project in the Twisp River looking at sort of that wood regime question. So this is the apex jam in the project that the Colville Tribes implemented in 2022. So the as-built is on the left. You can see the wood laid out there in a very engineered fashion, more or less. And then the photo on the right is after that 10 to 15 year flow event. So there is some flux of wood in the Twisp River, but they essentially made what was referred to earlier today a sticky channel that was going to capture that flux and retain it in the floodplain in a meaningful way. and result in actually inundating some historic floodplain and starting the recruitment process of future pieces of wood into the river. And with that, I just wanted to thank OMEP's funder, Bonneville Power Administration, as well as all the people who I don't know and may never know who collected all this data in the Twisp and Methow subbasin. So, thank you.
If our other speakers could please come up, we'll start our final Q&A session. So please come up to the standing mic or raise your hand for our runner to bring a microphone to you if you have questions.
Excellent talks. My question is for Tim, though. These watersheds that have a high frequency fire regime every less than 35 years, something like that, do you think the more appropriate technique or cost-effective technique, knowing that these watersheds are going to burn fairly frequently, would be to just put pilings in, and knowing that this area is going to burn, that we're going to get wood recruitment and collect, rather than you had mentioned or showed the images of some engineered log jams or engineered structures that actually burned up. So just your opinion on different techniques.
Yeah, I mean, that brings up a good point about even another lesson that we learned about those log structures that that had submerged, much of the submerged infrastructure of the log jam remained, whereas the rest of the log jam burned off. There's trade-offs, right, in designing these things, whether you want immediate effects from the structure that you're putting in, or if you have the time to wait for that function to develop over time. There's just trade-offs with all these things. So to your point, one of the approaches could be to stick your money in building smaller structures and more of them that would then rack mobile wood over some longer time scales, or stick with the status quo and build much larger structures that are more functional immediately. So I think it's part of a much larger discussion on what the priorities are of the restoration work and what the trade-offs are for different types of structures in different locations and things like that.
I'm going to add to what Tim said just a little bit, in that a lot of the structural integrity of those structures that did burn was still really persistent. Very large logs only burned, a small fraction of them, and so I think that they're still providing a lot of function out there, and will continue to rack material that is coming down downstream. And that material that gets recruited from, like, after a fire, it doesn't happen right away typically, unless there's some sort of hydraulic interaction with the floodplains or hill slope failures, that type of stuff. It takes several years for roots of trees to disintegrate to the point where the trees are then falling over, and only some portion of those ones that are along the margin of the river actually make it into that river. So the overall volume of wood that is recruited from these riparian burn fire events isn't immediate, and it isn't quite as much as I think we would expect to see just from looking at the catastrophe of a fire burning through an area.
So Tim, the fire study looked primarily at the impacts of fire on projects. What was learned in the study from your point of view on the potential impact of projects on the severity of fire, either in the sites or the literature review that was a part of it? or the possible ameliorating effects of projects on fire severity?
Yeah, probably what we learned most was that in those areas that had existing low elevation floodplains that had robust plant communities, riparian plant communities, or areas that had existing beaver activity, that those areas had already been so-called wetted up, were resilient to fire to begin with, and then promoted much more rapid response regeneration after the fire occurred.
Big fan of the work in the Twisp. Excellent job. But wanted to ask a question. Jared, do you think that you achieved your Fox and Bolton numbers for wood that was retained in the system?
Yeah, thanks for that. So one of the things that we did is looked at the volume estimates that Fox and Bolton provided, because that also takes into account some different scales of large wood in terms of like key piece features. So we tried to match that volume based on our cookie cutter 2.2 cubic meter log that we can import. And so I think that we have that in the system right now, though I don't know that it's distributed, quite evenly or where you would expect it to be distributed. There are some gravel bars, for instance, where you would expect mobile wood to just naturally hang up, where some log structures moved fairly significantly. And so it's definitely, I think we're close. It was a good shot at achieving our Fox and Bolton numbers, yeah.
Yeah, it looks great. Ryan, quick question for you. Which was higher? Was the delta between the current and the template, or the current and Fox and Bolton a higher number?
Oh, sorry.
I think you're asking a question that maybe not everybody in the audience knows what you're talking about. So in any event, the EDT basically functions and how the model is attributed. There's this patient template scenario. The template scenario that it was in EDT in these models was not the Fox and Bolton number, but I explored that and found that the template scenarios were somewhere sort of intermediate to the Fox and Bolton median and sort of 75th percentile target value. So it was in the range of some of these other papers that weren't in the initial recommendations or incorporated in template condition in these subbasins.
I find that there's a lot of emphasis on the number of pieces of wood, but Ryan, I liked at the end that you talked that that's ultimately we want the functionality of the wood, and I'm curious if there's any efforts to kind of quantify that functionality in a way, saying maybe we can get the same process and function that the Fox and Bolton numbers would kind of indicate without that number of logs.
Right. So what I didn't expand on is that some of those recommendations, or those recommendations are calling for a variety of piece sizes. These are all not a unimodal sort of size. The Fox and Bolton paper does call for, depending on channel size, I think somewhere between 5 and 8% of those pieces, quote unquote, should be key pieces for the appropriate channel size. And that, like, sort of, I did this analysis because I thought it was fun, and maybe if you're all here still here, you think it is too. But it really takes somebody like Jared or Matt to take those numbers and apply them and interpret them in a meaningful way. To have pieces that are going to rack wood, pieces that are going to be free and sort of fill in the interstitial spaces and aggregate and fill in the range of niche that wood does in the environment. And there are several of those papers do address those. I just didn't have time to really get to that. So.
And number of pieces was less important to us as the volume of wood that we were installing. So still quantified though.
That was great. Thanks on that. I just couldn't help but talk about the number of pieces and the volumes and the challenges of acquiring all that wood. We're up against that on all of our projects where maybe we design something, put it out to bid, and the contractor's like, yeah, but I can't get that unless I'm traveling a state away in some cases. So question is, do you have any recommendations for efficiencies or things you've learned that have made that $1 million that came from a different basin? If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that it's really important that we start looking at combining forest health treatments with aquatic restoration locally. That's really going to be the key where we find a significant amount of cost savings in trucking and acquisition of large wood.
We have time for one more question if we have any takers.
I'll follow up with that last question. Has there been any consideration of actually purchasing timber parcels, like doing timber sales for the purpose of aquatic restoration, considering if profit's not the only goal, we can probably, have better forest management practices on those timber sales than trying to maximize profit in that situation.
Yeah, there's been a lot of discussion about that over the last few years. In fact, all that slash that you saw, which is mostly green tree tops and stuff, that came from a harvest unit in Little Bridge Creek, so it was right there local. And I think that we're exploring all of our options for just acquiring, timber sale units to glean wood off of them. Yeah.
All right, with that, let's thank our speakers one last time here. Thank you. All right, and with that, I just wanted to say on behalf of the Upper Columbia Salmon Recovery Board, thank you to all the sponsors who made this possible, as well as all our speakers who really brought some fantastic topics here. And then to all of you for sticking around to the end. I hope you took something away from this. I know I certainly did. I look forward to seeing how these themes continue through our work here in the Upper Columbia. So thank you all again, and have a great night.
I'm off my feet, can't find the ground. You're oh so sweet, like tangerines and frozen roses, and I lose my breath, my heart does pound every time you're moving close and you hold me. let you go. I won't say goodbye, not for today. Wow, not even for tomorrow. I can't put you down, I can't quit you, baby. And I couldn't stop. Wow, not even if I wanted. And all I want is you, and all I need is you. You came around, now all I do is think about you. Hey. Well, I'm off my feet. I can't find the ground. You're oh so sweet, like tangerines and frozen roses, like tangerines and frozen roses. Hey, 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 hey. You're oh so sweet, like tangerines and frozen roses. Hey, 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 hey. They say that freight train is moving pretty fast through the yard. As we're sitting round this fire in the jungle, telling jokes and dealing cards. Well, I once was a rich man, I guess you could say as tough as nails. But the loss of a job and a woman took the wind out of my sails. So pass that two-bit whiskey bottle round. And when the morning comes, we'll hop a line to some forgotten town. Yes. So pass that two-bit whiskey bottle round. Yeah. We've all lost something, that was then, boys. This is now. I found this paper at the piers, in the trash on the docks. Another scandal over in D.C. guys hear that there's work in Oregon? Well, how about that, boys? We could work and save some money for the fall. And we can drink all the rest, 'cause we're only men, and that's all. So pass that 2-bit whiskey bottle round. And when the morning comes, we'll hop a line to some forgotten town. Hey! And pass that 2-bit whiskey bottle round. Yeah! We've all lost something, that was then, boys. This is now. Ah, yes, sir, I do declare. Toss a log on those coals, 'cause the fire treats me right. And I wouldn't mind a hot bath and a warm meal and a soft bed for the night. But they won't let me in the mission, yeah, they threw me out for drinking wine. And damn, I hate Seattle, 'cause it sure gets cold and it rains here all the time. So pass that 2-bit whiskey bottle round. And when the morning comes, we'll hop a line to some forgotten town. Yes. So pass that 2-bit whiskey bottle round. Yeah, yeah. We've all done something, that was then, boys. Well, this is now. That was then, boys. This is now.